Today, I have the great honor to introduce Ruth Nyambura, a Kenyan feminist, organizer, and researcher whose work has developed around ecological, feminist, and decolonial struggles for climate justice in Africa, but also in other parts of the Global South. Ruth Nyambura's organizing work is truly inspiring, having recently served as the global coordinator of the Hands of Mother Earth campaign to defend the planet against the threat of geoengineering experiments. She's also the founder and convener of the African Ecofeminists Collective, a platform for radical feminist and environmental politics and pedagogies aimed at challenging capitalist structures. She also created the No Red in Africa collective, which challenges forest-related carbon markets and documents the impacts of these schemes on local communities in Africa. She has previously worked as the head of advocacy for the African Biodiversity Network. In addition to her work as a social organizer, Ruth Nyambura has written extensively on the technocratic narratives of climate action, including geoengineering projects and agrarian transformations, often referred as the Second Green Revolution, revealing through this work the detachment of these initiatives from the lived realities of the people that are on the front lines of climate crisis. Ruth, your work has been an important source of inspiration for this workshop, and we are very honored and happy to have you here and welcome you again. I leave the floor to you now. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Te escuchamos.
Thank you so much, Nathalia, and thank you to everyone who is joining us. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. So I am going to start my presentation by reading, just to acknowledge that for the last 2 weeks, I have been in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for COP27, what was labeled as an African COP. And so I want to begin by reading a long article that I wrote in 2016 after the climate meeting in Marrakesh, the last time the Conference of Parties was in Africa. So I will not screen share this for this particular period, so I will just read it. So the paper is titled "In Between Rhetoric and Reality: A Climate Justice Process Completely Disconnected from Local Realities." A week or so before the beginning of COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco, protests erupted in Al Hoceima in northern Morocco after the death of a local fish seller, Mohsin Fikri. He was crushed to death inside a garbage truck belonging to the local authorities as he attempted to take back his fish, which had been confiscated. These protests were not only concentrated in the Rif region, where Al Hoceima is located. Thousands of Moroccans marched in faraway cities such as Casablanca, Safi, and even Marrakesh, demanding justice for his state-sponsored murder, as they called it, and for wider sociopolitical, economic rights and justice. The Moroccan government signed a fishing deal with the European Union in 2014 that gave tremendous fishing rights to 11 EU countries over the Moroccan coast for the low price tag of 30 million euros per year. This deal gives unfettered access to 120 ships from these countries, while local fishermen like Mohsin Fikri, whose livelihoods depend on the little fish that is left by the EU, are left to deal with a ruthless police force that denies them access to the ocean to fish and criminalizes their informal trade, often confiscating their fish and destroying their markets. These same small-scale fishermen are dealing with the impacts of a changing climate on their coasts, which multiplies the effects of the socioeconomic inequalities that trade agreements such as this one present to them. By the time COP22 began in Marrakesh on the 7th of November 2016, there were daily solidarity protests all over the country, where Mohsin's death and by extension, the plight of Morocco's small-scale fishermen was being highlighted. At this very point, the climate meeting itself had become a serious point of criticism amongst Moroccans, and specifically the protesters in Marrakesh, who called it a greenwashing exercise for the national and international elites as well as corporations. In one protest, a female protester famously held up a banner, and on it were the words, "Welcome to COP22. We grind people here," in reference to the cruel way in which Mohsen Fikri had met his death. For me, it was a point of reflection around the class, gendered, racial, and geopolitical dynamics over which battle lines have been drawn in the multilateral spaces where climate discussions are held, most notably the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and just how disconnected this discussion seemed to be from the urgency for strong climate action and the realities of people at the forefront of the impacts of the climate crisis and the existing inequalities that are exacerbated by the climate crisis. The political is personal. On the day the UN climate meeting began in Marrakesh, a group of leftist Moroccan activists, feminists, and filmmakers set out on a solidarity caravan with 7 other climate justice activists from across Africa to the Imida protest camp on Mount Alban, about 300 kilometers south of Marrakesh, for an alternative and grassroots climate justice and ecofeminist gathering, as well as the very first environmental justice film festival on top of the occupied mountain. For the last 6 years, a movement of the indigenous Amazigh people of the region has set up an encampment on Mount Alban after shutting off an important water valve that transported water to a silver mine company, which is owned by a private company under the control of the Moroccan royal family. It is Africa's largest and most productive silver mine company, while Morocco ranks as the 15th biggest silver producer in the world. This silver mine company, popularly known as Managem, has been accused by the residents of Imida of poisoning their water sources with the toxic chemicals used in the mines, as well as draining their water reserves. The Global Amazigh Congress, an international organization which works for the rights of the Amazigh peoples, released a report in 2015, which stated, among other things, that the mine uses 1,555 cubic meters of water per day, which is 12 times the daily water consumption of the village. The mine has also destroyed their agricultural life, with soils also affected by the mining chemical toxins, not forgetting that a lot of the land belonging to the villagers was confiscated for the setting up of the mine. In August 2011, the communities inhabiting Imida began what is now believed to be the longest protest movement in the recent history of Morocco. This uprising has concretely brought together the intersections of environmental injustice with state repression and militarization, the growing power and influence of corporations, specifically those in the extractive industries, the gendered impacts of ecological degradation, the political economy of commodities, the labor concerns in mining impacted communities, and the pitfalls and possibilities of popular protests and uprising in bringing environmental justice to the people. I was part of the Solidarity Caravan to Imida, and on my return to Marrakesh on the 5th day of COP22, I walked into the UN complex in which the conference was being held to officially register as an observer. One of the very first things I saw was an advertisement by Managem. It turns out that this same mining conglomerate, which is being protested by communities for committing ecocide 300 kilometers away from the COP22 venue, was one of the official sponsors of COP22, the most important international climate and environmental meeting of the year. Irony is not dead, but we may bludgeon it to death yet. So that is the very first part of my presentation. And it's important when we think about the politics of protest resistance, the possibilities, the pitfalls, especially on the continent of Africa, and the long histories of these kinds of protests. But importantly, thinking about them, not just in terms of a longue durée framework, but thinking about them in this particular context of environmental movements, thinking about them within the context of multilateral environmental negotiation process, such as the UNFCCC's COP process, the recent one which ended just a few days ago. And the context of IMIDA is particularly important when you think about the fact that the COP was held in Egypt, in a country where, it's estimated, anything between 60,000, there's between 60,000 and 80,000 political prisoners in this country. When you think about the injustice in the last 11, 12 years that have happened in this space, when you think about also the limitations of these multilateral spaces in terms of, being able to push forward a radical vision of ecological justice, of environmental justice, but also the kind of work that grassroots movements on the continent of Africa, in the wider global South, but also across the globe, the kind of work that frontline communities like those in IMIDA continue to do to challenge ecocide, but also to have the revolutionary dreams around what liberation actually looks like for the people. So I'll just start my screen share in just 1 second. Just 1 second. Let me get the, okay, share. Okay, view. Sorry, just 1 second. I hope everyone can see. Please view, enter full screen. Okay, so I hope to see my screen. Please.
It's not in full screen yet, Ruth.
Okay. Hold on. Okay.
Maybe you can do it at the bottom with the little cup on the right, more in the icon. There is like a little vase or.
Sorry.
Right there.
Yes.
There you are. Yeah.
Well, technology is technology. So my presentation today is titled, and this is part of a larger, part of a political discussion that we've been having within the African Ecofeminist Collective and my own present intellectual journey. So it's titled Test Runs for Liberation, African Ecofeminist Insurrectionist Histories in the Struggles for the Commons. So basically tracing the long histories across 3 political generations. So my conversation, my talk today traces, insurrectionist work, ecofeminist movements, women's movements on the continent of Africa, on the intersections of what we call the gendered commons across 3 political generations, thinking about the very beginning, the anti-colonial resistance, the women in the anti-colonial resistance, thinking about the onset of neoliberal globalization in the 70s and the 80s, the late 70s and the early 80s, and women's responses, to neoliberal globalization. And finally, thinking with present ecofeminist movements that have emerged in the last decade, considering, the food and energy crisis from 2007 and 2008, but also thinking with what's being described presently as, a new great land rush, right? And a more commodification and privatization of the commons. So sitting with these 3 political generations of movement work by African women, and sitting with them thinking about, coloniality, colonialism, the afterlives of colonialism, and how to think about environmental justice and ecological justice. So the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements in Africa cannot be fully understood outside of the earlier struggles waged by African women against the colonial decimation of their livelihoods, their communities, their productive and reproductive resources. African women have always been central to the colonial political economy, and basically constituted the conditions of possibility for the migrant labor economy that supported the process of primitive accumulation through their dispossession. Lina Some, a radical Kenyan feminist economist, notes the centrality of African women's resistance to anti-colonial struggles by stating that their demands regarding the control over their fertility provided a basis upon which anti-colonial and anti-imperialist rebellions grew, even as the latter may not have constituted women's overt claims. So while modern ecological, climate, agrarian struggles, depends on what you call it, in Africa, was surfaced materially in relation to anti-colonial resistance against primitive accumulation and dispossession, the accounting of these struggles has generally glossed over the critical role that African women played in these battles and has largely been devoted to their wholesale relocation into nationalist demands. So this subsumption of women-led anti-colonial eco-agrarian struggles in Africa within anti-imperialist and nationalist frameworks, analytical structures which, while crucially important, have long and continue to be prone to a masculinist hyperfocus and have tended to overlook the very gendered nature and reverberations of the liberatory thought and praxis of the struggles over the gendered ecological agrarian commons led by these women's movements. In addition, this containment of African women's histories of resistance, chiefly and liberally within these dominant frameworks, right, of anti-imperialism and nationalism, have failed to fully capture the grounded imperatives that precipitated them, and importantly, the continuities and discontinuities of this earlier struggles from the colonial period as espoused by the present ecological, ecofeminist movements in Africa. So the term gendered ecological agrarian commons, which is first of all put forth by Teresa Turner, is used here, I use it basically to refer to those places in the world in which women and men live in common, basically the politics of the commons, within elaborated subsistence relations, far from or actively rejecting the coercive policies of commodification, as well as both building and defending alternatives to socially and ecologically destructive global corporate capitalism, dating back from colonialism. So to move forward into the next period of resistance by African women around the commons. So with the advent of structural adjustment programs from the late 1970s, not too long after most countries had gained independence from colonial rule, African women's anti-colonial struggles were transformed into fierce class-gendered, even ethnicized battles against neoliberal globalization across the continent. These new forms of resistance from below against the World Bank and IMF policies symbolize not a departure, but distinct continuities with women's anti-colonial struggles against the capitalist enclosures of the gendered commons. The inheritance of colonialism and these contemporary neocolonial economic and geopolitical processes, as well as the progression of the histories and experiences of exploitation, opened up a new historical continuity of a wave of active resistance across the continent of Africa and, of course, across the rest of the global South. Structural adjustment programs produced particular conditions within which multinational corporations, in conjunction with, as well as national governments, orchestrated and supported violence in both urban and rural areas. The spaces, productive and reproductive, within which women and poor people in Africa operated came under particularly severe attacks as the state sought to basically both control and curtail in the process of implementing these conditionalities imposed by the structural adjustment programs. At the same time, these same conditions of exploitation helped shape new resistance battles by African women, as can be seen by various popular movements that sprang up in the 1980s and 1990s. Some important examples of these movements during this key period include the mass mobilizations by women in the Niger Delta, the Ogarefe resistance in 1984, and the Ekpan resistance of 1986, all women's uprisings, which were against privatization, multinational oil corporations such as Shell, state violence, and militarization, and importantly, against oil extraction and in defense of their land and their territories. Leigh Brownhill borrows Arrighi's framework of the long 20th century by excavating and critically examining what she describes as an unbroken century-long chain of social movements led by African women against colonial and capitalist enclosures of the gendered commons in Africa. Using both of these analytical approaches, Arrighi's and Brownhill's, one can argue decisively that these two waves, the anti-colonial movement and the new movements against structural adjustment programs, as mentioned above, have opened up space and insights to the present wave of struggles for the gendered commons being witnessed presently on the continent. These new movements are primarily housed within a climate justice framework, although others abound, such as food sovereignty, and are led by self-described ecofeminist activists and collectives. And two particular groups stand out in particular: Women, the Women Collective against extractivism, and the Southern African Rural Women's Assembly, and I might add, as well as the African Ecofeminist Collective, which I'm part of. They are transnational in nature, working across several African countries, and with strong international links with academia, anti-extractivist, anti-privatization movements, unions, climate and environmental justice groups, indigenous peoples movements, food sovereignty, landless peoples movements such as Abahlali Basemjondolo, that is based in South Africa, and peasant social movements, as well as non-governmental organizations. Importantly, they also espouse strong anti-capitalist and feminist politics, or at the very least, their politics are contained within the vast canon of progressive and anti-patriarchal gender politics. These movements and collectives across Africa often attempt to employ a historical materialist approach to both understand and interlink ecological questions with gendered and economic ones. The earlier two struggle periods, the anti-colonial movement and the movements against during the onset of structural adjustment programs waged over the gendered commons, strongly inform the present battles of the present the battles being waged by the present ecofeminist movements, as well as their strategies, as they consider them the antecedents to their own interrelated and basically a long history still unfolding, and whose materiality arises out of the same processes of global accumulation and dispossession beginning from the colonial period, and thus lending much credence to the analytical approach being proposed by that Brownhill proposes. So how do we make sense of histories of resistance? And especially when we think about the framework around ecology, climate, agrarian struggles. So these are some of the questions to basically sit with and think with. And these are some of the questions that have been present in this long unbroken chain, 100 years, a century of resistance by African women around the struggles for ecology. So what are the vernaculars and cultures of liberation over the gendered agrarian commons in Africa? So what are their justificatory premises, including the material realities? Because as mentioned, they're also movements that are very ideological in nature. So what are these justificatory promises that inform and activated the vernaculars and cultures of liberation of these women's movements? What do these vernaculars and cultures reveal about the ways in which these movements conceived and experienced power? What do they tell us about women's claims, African women's claims about the gendered commons across generations? Especially if we are to think about the afterlives, the long history of colonialism that is still unfolding. And how do they inform their counter-hegemonic strategies? counter-hegemonic strategies against patriarchy, against colonialism, against structural adjustment programs, against privatization, against the climate crisis, against false solutions to the climate crisis, such as carbon markets. So as well as the conceptions of the pluriverse and cosmologies of freedom. So what are the continuities and discontinuities of these cultures of liberation and resistance across political generations, as we see across 3 political generations? What do they reveal about the nature, the transnational and international nature of the political economy and political ecology from which they emerge from across time? And also borrowing the political concepts of imagined communities, Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, as well as communities of resistance, by Chandra Mohanty. What modes of travel, co-creation, and pastiche, so biocultural, corporeal, symbolic, spiritual, material, and cosmological, have been mobilized by these cultures of resistance and liberation across generations in Africa and across borders, because they are transnational in nature. So to think about these 3 periods, how can we also think about these 3 periods as archives, right? Archives of resistance, rituals of resistance in conversation with one another. How does a politics of liberation and resistance emerge when we look at these 3 long periods of movement work, specifically as oppositional consciousness, as moving archives of co-created strategies of resistance, as collective identity, and then as solidarity across time and across space? And what have been the limits and possibilities of these cultures and vernaculars and transcripts of resistance to structurally undermine patriarchy and the processes of capitalist accumulation over the commons in Africa? So I'll stop my screen share. So basically, so these questions have been very fundamental in the kinds of analyses around different political generations of African women fighting back against basically enclosures of the commons. However, these enclosures manifest themselves, whether it is seed and trade laws that criminalize the right of peasant smallholder farmers, majority of whom are women on the continent of Africa, to save, sell, and exchange their seeds, whether it has been the privileging of private property rights over land, right, that continues to dispossess African women, right? Whether it's to think about the present climate crisis, right? The responses from the state, but also responses and articulation within multilateral and international spaces. You know, what spaces have they provided for resistance? How are they in conversation with these processes? And especially thinking specifically about the false solution to the climate crisis. So I will pause the presentation here and open up the conversation.